The next session is really probably the confluence of really what we're here to talk about. We're going to talk about something that we introduced last year. For 5 years, many of the people in the room, many of the people online, about 75 people worked together with the Living Heart Project and the FDA to do something called an in-silico clinical trial, which is basically we use the living heart to generate an entire population and then analyze it for its credibility using the tools that we heard about this morning for the VNV40, but applying them to not just the device, but the device, the patient, the cohort, the clinical treatment, the entire process. And we went through it in some detail this morning. If you were in the technical session, you saw it. So what we're going to do today, right now, is not go through that trial, but talk about the implications of it. The fact that the FDA has now published a set of guidelines that says that using the VNV40 framework that we heard about, you can actually run an entire in silico clinical trial and use it, not just to design a better product, but to design a better trial, a smaller trial. We heard from Michael how they've done that in some areas already. Our goal is to make that the standard practice so that you've already run the trial before you actually put it in the first person. So I've asked one of the collaborators, Steve Kreuzer, to start us off and to spend, let's go back, spend about 10 minutes or so just introducing the topic, the trial itself, what it means. And then following that, I'm going to introduce a number of guests who are going to share their thoughts on what this means, the implications of it, if we could get really professional at doing that the way we do a standard clinical trial. So with that, I'd like to invite Steve to the stage. Please join me in welcoming him.
All right. Start. All right. Here we go. All right. Thanks, guys, everybody, for coming over here to listen. All the folks eating the food, I hope you're hearing this as well. We're going to talk, as Steve teed up here, we're going to talk a little bit about my favorite topic, in silico clinical trials. We'll talk a bit about the credibility aspects. We'll really try to pick up some of the nice conversation that was brought in the prior presentation, specifically around this question of credibility. We'll look to extend it then into the future. And what does that mean? What are the capabilities that the credibility processes that we have in place give us to be able to do these in silico clinical trials? So let's get to it. We talked a lot already about the promise of in silico methods. I do love this chart, but I don't want to dwell on it too much. The idea, though, and I think Michael really hit the nail on the head earlier, is this concept of improving our product development times, really reducing costs, all of these other ideas that were brought up. We are here, though, to talk about in silico clinical trials and where we get the credibility to be able to go out and really say some of these things about the value of simulations and what they may teach us with respect to clinical performance of devices. Before we get there, though, we have talked about this, and Joyce did a wonderful job walking through the VNV40 standard. I'm not going to talk too much about this particular flowchart. Again, we've already seen it. But I do want to make sure we're all familiar with the concepts of credibility, because it's incredibly important. If we don't have credibility in our modeling and simulation approaches, we're never going to be able to get the kind of trust that was discussed earlier, the kind of buy-in that we need to be able to leverage these tools. So credibility, trust, you see the definition there. Now, what's important to understand is that VNV40 as a standard, at this point, it's 7 years old. Before that, it was obviously in development prior to publication in 2018. It's a foundation for our work. It's a foundation, though, that was built on preclinical applications largely, where you're talking about comparison to the types of benchtop analyses and testing that Joyce went through in a prior presentation. But that foundation did serve the purpose of creating a standard that allowed the FDA to build on and support the construction, as we see there, of the infrastructure for these in silico clinical trials. So what I've shown on this slide there in this table, and I've got some nice arrows pointing to the type of evidence that we now have the ability to compare through the use of this guidance, through many of the same concepts and fundamentals that are rooted in ASME V&V40, but some of these ideas and types of evidence that really lend themselves and provide us with the tools to run these in silico clinical trials. I'll point out the top two of those: in vivo validation results, population level statistics. These are the sorts of things that don't show up in V&V40, but they are obviously important for our uses from an in silico clinical trial perspective. So the fantastic developments that these put together, and Kenny is going to be on the panel. I understand he played a significant role in writing this guidance, so many thanks to him and the other authors from the FDA in putting this out there for the rest of the community to really take advantage of. Without this, we couldn't do any of the in silico clinical trial work that we hope to be doing, and that is being done. So with that, and talking about a particular in silico clinical trial that's obviously near and dear to the hearts of many of those in this room, I guess pun intended, we have the ENRICHMENT in silico clinical trial. We're not going to go through the details, although I do have some animations that look pretty in a subsequent slide here. But this was a really significant effort. Many of the Dassault team members, as well as participants from across the industry, got together to work through this challenge of really trying to understand what do we need to do to run an in silico clinical trial. This was one of those things that really, I think we ended up with more questions, honestly, than we found answers. And it does remind me of the old Mike Tyson quote of, "Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the mouth." We got into this project and we had a plan for what we were going to do, and it was challenging. We ran into a lot of difficulties. We had all the computational resources in the world, the best tools available, but many of the challenges that were discussed earlier in terms of adoption, in terms of interdisciplinary need to communicate, in terms of data access, all of these things, questions that we will discuss on this panel, were brought to bear in this project. So I like to think that we, after getting perhaps punched in the mouth to get the project started, we found some answers and we found an approach. And what that led to was something that looks a little bit like this. This is my own representation of this. It's a little bit basic with respect to the flow charts, but the concepts are there. And this is how I like to think, at least, about in silico clinical trials in terms of the various components that go into these models. There's my own definition there and some key attributes that I think are important as we think about in silico clinical trials. But the key pieces that go into this process include things like the ability to model a device, the ability to create a platform for your virtual patients so that you can create these beautiful cohorts of virtual patients that you can then use your device in to predict acute performance before you get to that final box of predicted clinical endpoints. Not an easy process to go through there, and what we landed on was a hierarchical approach. We termed these or referred to them as submodels. Up in the top right-hand corner, you see a schematic or a diagram of this. The bottom left-hand corner are a couple of videos, hopefully they played when we got started, that show the implementation of this edge-to-edge repair device in a valve repair scenario. But ultimately, what we want to do here is we want to go from a hierarchical approach to predict this device performance in order to get to a prediction for clinical results. Again, it's not an easy task to put all those things together. And if we think about the different kinds of evidence and the different kinds of models, rather, that are represented in that top right-hand corner, it's really important for us to appreciate that there are these different stakeholders in the room as we talk about and as we develop these models. You see there's a clinician model represented not by a person, but by, I guess, a clipboard, a stethoscope, and some other tools. We need to understand, how do the clinicians implement these devices? How do they think through this? What do they do? That's incredibly important. We need to understand things like, what are the real clinical outcomes that matter? So Dr. Hoganson went through and talked about all of these wonderful applications that he has. In that case, there are many direct relationships between engineering outcomes and clinical outcomes. In many circumstances, we don't have that benefit. So we need to figure out, how do we deal with that? We need to bring all the stakeholders together to be able to answer these questions and talk through the approaches. We did that, and I'm really, really proud of the playbook that was put together. And we see on the left-hand side there the screenshot of the first page of this document. So do go to the Dassault page, the 3DS page, where they talk about this particular trial. There's some links there. There's some recognition of this project as one of the Fast Company Innovations of the Year for last year, I believe it was. But you want to go through this document. If you have any interest whatsoever in in-silico clinical trials, pick this up. Pick up the companion papers. Pick up the supplement, I'll say. And a shout out to Zhang, who's in the audience here, who did a lot of the work on this. Yes, claps. Yes, please. Let's embarrass her. Zhang, you're awesome. The supplement itself, though, has all of the gory or some of the gory technical details that we went through. So if you really want to get into it, pick that supplement up. But the document itself walks through these questions. And it, much like VNV40, it doesn't give you answers necessarily, but it tells you the questions to ask yourself. And that's the key thing that we want to do here. Because as we look at in silico clinical trials, there are many questions. The future is challenging. We do have many questions in these categories that Steve is going to pose to the panelists in a moment here. But as we think about this, these types of issues are things we need to deal with. Things like, how do we demonstrate clinical value? How do we have balance across the industry? How do we demonstrate translational impact? Things like regulatory adoption. I don't know if we have any regulatory folks in here, but it is sometimes a challenge to talk to them and to understand what they need out of a model and what can we deliver? What do we need them to understand? Things of this nature. Data interoperability. Very challenging to get some of this data that's intended and has, through the decades, been designed for a clinical application and for a clinical input, and turn it into the types of models and the types of information that we really need here. And lastly, we can't go through a presentation without talking about AI. Is very important. How do we leverage AI? How do we do things like simulants in order to really supercharge what we're doing with these trials? Because we may get the physics right, but it's really important that we can do these things at scale. So I'm excited for the conversation with Steve and the other panelists. Really grateful that you guys are here and interested in this topic. I do think it's incredibly important that we get this right, and that's not a given. So let's take it from there, Steve, and let's get into it.